Herzlich willkommen im Namen des Center for Literature
Welcome here at the Center of Literature
zum letzten
on
Tag
Burg
unseres
Hülshoff.
Workshops
Welcome online to the
Postwestfälische
last day of our workshop
in den
on
letzten Tagen viele
post-Westphalian
spannende
literature.
Beiträge gehört
Over the
zu
last 2
Literatur
days, we
oder
heard
vielmehr
many
Literaturrennen
interesting
jenseits von
inputs
Staatsgrenzen,
and
jenseits von
presentation about
nationalen
literature
Grenzen.
that
Auch
transcends the
Literatur
borders of
produzieren. Wir
states
werden
and
gerne mal oder wurden
international
in der
borders.
Vergangenheit gerne mal zu Nationaldichtern
Often
hoch
declared
stilisiert.
as
Das wissen wir
national
hier jetzt bei
poets
der
in the
Annette von
past.
Droste-Hülshoff
Here
Stiftung
in the
natürlich ganz
foundation, in the
besonders
Annette von
gut.
Droste-Hülshoff
So
Foundation, we know
beschäftigt
that
uns
very
auch die
well,
Frage,
and that is
was
why we are
passiert denn
very
jetzt mit
interested
einer
in the
sogenannten
question
großen
of what
deutschen
happens
Dichterin, wenn sie
with
in andere
a
Sprachen
big
übersetzt wird.
German
Genau
poet
diesem
if
Problem
that is
widmen wir uns
translated into
in
other
dem
languages. What does
CFL-Projekt
that translation do
Trans-Droste,
to her?
das ich heute
And that's what we're
vorstellen
looking
möchte. Ich
at
betreue es
in
zusammen
our
mit meinem Kollegen
Trans-Droste
Maximilian Körner
project. We're going
und
to
wir haben da viele
introduce that
Konzepte
project to you
übernommen
today. I
von
am
Albrecht und Nestle
leading
Tansch,
that with
also
my
auch da
colleague
waren wieder
Max
viele
Körner.
mitwirkende
We
Beteiligte.
have many
Trans-Droste ist ein
experts
digital
on board
basiertes
that you already know
Übersetzungslabor
from
zu
the last
Texten
2
Annette
days.
von
Trans-Droste is a
Droste-Hülshoff.
digitally based
Wir haben
translation lab
damit Ende
working on texts
2020
of
begonnen
Annette von
und sind jetzt
Droste-Hülshoff.
weiter
We
mittendrin.
launched the
Das
project
Projekt
at the
versammelt
end
eine
of
Runde von
2020 and now we are in
Übersetzenden,
the
die sich
midst.
in
The project
mehreren
brings a group of
Teillaboren
translators together who
verschiedenen
in
Texten
several
der Poetin Annette
sublabs
von Droste-Hülshoff
work in
widmet.
depth
Die
on
Texte
important
werden derzeit
texts
in 6 Sprachen
from
übersetzt,
Annette von
nämlich Englisch,
Droste-Hülshoff. Currently, we are
Französisch,
translating into
Nordkurdisch,
6
Türkisch,
languages:
Farsi
English,
und
French,
Arabisch.
Northern Kurdish,
Veröffentlicht werden die
Turkish,
Texte
Farsi,
nach
and
und nach auf der
Arabic.
digitalen
The
Burg,
texts will
also
then be
wo Sie jetzt auch
published
uns
one by
folgen
one
können auf dem
in
Stream
the
auf
digital castle where you are
digitale-burg.de.
maybe watching us right
Wichtig
now.
ist uns in diesem gesamten Projekt,
What is
dass
important to
dem
us in the
Übersetzen an sich
entire
auch das
project
Reflektieren
is that
über
in
das
addition
Übersetzen
to the
und die
translation
Texte
itself,
sowie die in
there
ihnen
is space
verarbeiteten
for
Diskurse
reflection on the
eingebaut sind.
translation and the
Zum
text
Auftakt
and
des
the
zweiten Labors
discourses
haben wir dazu
processed
in
in them.
Workshops verschiedene
To kick off the
Expertinnen
second
aus der
lab, we
Wissenschaft
invited various
eingeladen, sich
academics to
mit den
engage in conversation
ÜbersetzerInnen
with the
ins Gespräch zu
translators.
begeben. Das Ergebnis
And the
eines
result
dieser
of one
Workshops
of those
konnten Sie sich
workshops
gestern schon
is
ansehen
something that you were able
bzw.
to watch
anhören,
yesterday,
nämlich
or
in Form des
you were able
Hörstücks
to
von
listen to it
Hosseini nochmal
yesterday.
Event
That was the
zu Annette von
feature that we heard
Droste-Hülshoffs Gedichtbuch Klänge aus
yesterday
dem Orient
or
als
last
Teil
night.
unserer
That audio
Transforming Klänge
feature
aus dem
about the
Orient.
sounds from the Orient.
Wir haben im ersten Labor von Trans-Droste,
In
das wir auch
the
Labor
first
Landschaft nennen,
lab
zusammen
of
mit Jane
Trans-Droste,
Anderson,
which we
Daniel
call
Falk,
the
Nick Cave und
landscape,
Annie Rutherford,
which is the
eine Auswahl
landscape
typischer Droste-Texte, wenn man so will, ins
lab,
Englische
we
übersetzt.
translated
Also das waren
typical
Gedichte, ihre
Droste
Heidebilder,
poems into English.
Prosatexte
Shane
und
Anderson, Daniel
Briefe.
Falk,
Es waren
Monica
Texte,
Ring,
die sich in
and Annie
erster Linie
Rutherford
mit
were on board there.
dem Leben,
The
dem
texts that
Landleben, dem
we
Leben
translated
auf
there were
der
primarily
Burg Hülshoff
concerned with
beispielsweise
rural
in
life in
Westfalen
Westphalia,
beschäftigten,
around
also
Burg
mit den
Hülshoff.
Orten des
So
Lebens und
the
Schaffens von
texts
Annette von
actually were about the
Droste-Hülshoff.
places
Im
that
zweiten
Annette
Labor
von
von
Droste-Hülshoff
Trans-Droste,
knew
also im
from her
zweiten
life and wrote
Teillabor,
about.
geht es
In the
also
second
um die Klänge aus dem Orient, den
sublab of
Gedichtzyklus, der uns jetzt
Trans-Droste,
auch
we're going to look
in
at
diesem
sounds
Workshop
from the
vor allem
Orient.
begleitet hat.
That is
In
something
diesem
that
Labor
we
bringen wir
looked
Annette
at
von
in this
Droste-Hülshoff
workshop
in Dialog
closely as
mit
well.
den tatsächlichen
And
Räumen
in
und
this lab, we
Realitäten,
will
die der Begriff
try
Orient für sie
to
verbarg.
get
Deshalb werden die Klänge aus
to
dem Orient
create a
nicht nur ins
dialogue
Englische und
between
Französische
Droste-Hülshoff
übersetzt,
and the actual
sondern eben
spaces
auch in
and
Sprachen von Mandi,
realities that
Türkisch,
hide
Arabisch
behind the
und
term of
Farsi.
Orient.
Mit
We
im
are not only
Übersetzer im
translating
Team
into
sind
English and French,
Kaouther
but also into
Tabai,
Comanche,
Shani
Turkish,
Kirkut, Barbara
Arabic, and
Fontaine,
Farsi.
Tevfik
Barbara
Turan und
Fontaine,
Mahmoud
Shine
Hosseini
Kirkut,
Sad.
Kaouther
Ich freue
Tabai,
mich, dass
Tevfik
sich hier
Turan,
heute in
Mehmet
diesem
Hosseini
Panel
Sad
auch 3
are the team of
ÜbersetzerInnen vor
translators.
Ort
And
bzw.
today we have
digital
3
zugeschaltet
translators here
hier
with
mit am
us
Tisch sitzen
today.
habe.
They are here or they're
Kaouther
coming to
Tabai, Annie
us
Rutherford, beide online
live
dabei
via
und hier
internet.
neben
Annie
mir Mahmoud
Rutherford, Kaouther
Hosseini Sad.
Tabai
Ich
are
werde
here
die 3 Mitwirkenden
online,
einmal kurz vorstellen,
and
für alle, die
Mahmoud
gestern
Hosseini
Abend nicht
Sad is
dabei
here in
waren.
person.
Kaouther Tabai ist
Kaouther
Autorin,
Tabai
Übersetzerin und
is
Informatikerin. Sie
translator,
veröffentlichte mehrere
author, and computer
Kurzgeschichtenbände
science
beim Frankfurter
scientist. She has
Claret
published
Verlag,
several
so auch ihr
volumes of short stories with
Erstlingswerk
the
Das kleine
Frankfurt-based Claret
Dienstmädchen.
Verlag,
Und eine
including her
besondere
debut work,
Begeisterung für die
The Little
Übersetzung
Maid,
von
das kleine
Lyrik und
Dienstmädchen.
übertrug
She
beispielsweise
She has a particular affinity for translating poetry. She translated, for example, Carnations in the Night of Her Hair, a book of poems by Syrian poet Sa Quadri, from Arabic into German, and most recently the poetry collection The Songs Aren't at Fault Here was published by her. Annie Rutherford is coming to us from Edinburgh, not from Berlin, as Kaouther Tabai. She's a translator and writer who works as Associate Director of Stanza, Scotland's International Poetry Festival. She's a presenter at Free Words, an occasional podcast on queer poetry, and she's a fiction editor at the literary magazine The Interpreter's House. Translating, she devotes most her time to poetry from German, in German, and has translated Nora Gomminger, Klinger Tod, Maren Kamis, and Levin Mestermann. Mahmoud Hosseini is writer and literary translator. After studying political science in Munich, he worked in various positions, including the Iranian television and radio, and he also worked as a translator at the German embassy in Tehran. He also was a professor at the university in Tehran. He wrote and published 4 collections of stories and 1 novel in Iran. And in 2013, he received the Goethe Medal of the Goethe Institute for his translations of contemporary literature. Now I would like to give the floor to our translators directly. I would like to start with a question to all of you. When you translate the classics, which Annette von Droste-Hülshoff's work undoubtedly falls under, you always face the problem that you're not only translating into another language, but also into another time. In our case, you're translating into the 21st century. What was it like for you to translate Annette von Droste-Hülshoff? Was it difficult or easy for you to find an approach to her and her texts? I would like to propose that you start, Annie, because you have been on board the longest, really. Yeah, it's different, I'd say. Most of the time, I translate people who are alive most of the time. Actually, I have only translated for people that are still alive, and then I can talk to them, I can argue with them. If there's something that I don't understand, I can contact them directly. And if the author has been dead for 250 years, then that's not possible. That was the biggest challenge for me. Also, generally, I work with people that I know their voice, I know what they sound like. And that is very important for me. When I translate, I need to be able to recreate their voice. And with Droste, you have to imagine a little bit what her voice could have sounded like. But that also creates a freedom. You can be a bit more playful. You can often have that feeling, I need to be modern now. That's like a pressure. And that's something that didn't exist in this regard. And I was able to write things that don't fit with our time. Kaouther, how was it for you? Well, I knew Hülshoff from a book that talked about women who wrote. So she wasn't totally unknown to me, but I would never have thought of translating her poems. I didn't know her poems before. So when you approached me, when you asked me, that was a new task for me. I would have never, by myself, have had the idea to translate authors from other centuries. If I had done that, I probably would have looked for authors from my own culture. But I thought that this was a challenge that was really interesting to me. And when I started working, we started on the fall of the Barmacides, and I saw that I was really in my element, because that story had a huge impression on me when I was a child. So it was not difficult to get into it at all. The next poems were also very accessible to me, but I don't know how this is going to go on. I think the next poems are going to be bigger challenges. But yeah, the start, the first poems were really great. I'm enthusiastic about it. Yeah, maybe to give you some background, we started with 3 poems from Sounds of the Orient, Heartfelt, Du goldgesticktes Zelt, and The Fall of the Barmekins. Mahmoud, how did you get into Droste? How did you experience it? Well, first of all, I need to say thank you. Yesterday, I didn't even thank you for having me, for inviting me, so I'm going to do that today. Thank you for having me in this project. I didn't get into it at all, I must say, because when I translate, I do that in a very distanced way. So I'm very distanced from Droste and her time, and then I go via the author and approach the subject via the author. I use secondary literature, and yeah, Annette von Droste-Hülshoff, I didn't know her. And when I taught this process in university, a student approached me. She wanted to work on Drostes' work Judenbuche. And as for my strategy, I did the same thing you did. I have my own theory. I have translated for half a century, and I developed my own theory, I'd say. For classics and also for poems, that is something that I very seldomly do. For example, for once, we wanted to translate the collected works of Bertolt Brecht. That didn't work out in the end, but we worked on many of his poems, and we developed our own theory for doing that. So, but what do? I do the same thing that Droste did. Droste sat here in this castle in the Münsterland area. She thought about the Orient, and it was very abstract for her. And that's exactly what I do. I take her poems into my room, to my desk. And, for example, when we sat down together online, some of my colleagues said that they have a tapestry that shows Venice, and that can also be a source of inspiration. When I translate with distance.
Yes, there is this tapestry that shows scenes of the Naples harbor. I'm not really sure about that. But yes, that still exists, I think, doesn't it? Yes, exactly. And I had that in my own mind, and then I translate. Yeah, that goes really well with the rooms where we are right now. There are many interesting wallpapers here as well, and I think the setting is very fitting. It's quite inspiring, I think. Okay, but back to the first part of the lab, the translation into English. Annie, it was 4 of you working on the translation. You with Jane Anderson, Daniel Falb, and Monika Rink. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit about the cooperation within the team. Of course, I'd love to. First of all, thank you, but there's a family living on top of my flat, and I think that their child is currently jumping around. I hope that's not a problem. But yes, it was 4 of us, and it was very interesting. What we did is we said, okay, each one of us deals with a third of the amount of the text and translates that himself or herself, and ended up with a version of the translation. But that wasn't the final version, of course. And then we sat down in teams of 2. So each one of us chose a partner, and we went through our texts, through the translations, talked about them, commented them. And yeah, sometimes we were like, okay, I was very irritated at that point. I didn't know how to deal with this part. And then the other person maybe brought in his or her own idea. And then the first person would revise his or her version with those comments. And then the 4 of us looked at it, at the texts, and I think it took us about 3 hours to talk about the 4 poems. So yeah, it was thorough. definitely. And yes, we looked at each word, at each term, and any moment where one of us maybe felt like we were too far away from the original text. So we really looked at that, and it was very interesting because every time we revised the text, the perspective sort of got broader and we understood even more about the text. So for myself, I know that we all have very different ideas. And if we would have worked in teams of twos, then it would have been difficult. But as a group of four, it worked really well. It was very balanced and it was an interesting task. I was there. I participated in quite a few of the meetings that took place via Zoom. And it was very impressive to see how much work and how much time you put into that work. We had a meeting like that for Sounds from the Orient. And, well, in this project, we are working at translating the poems into different languages, not just into one. So, Mahmoud and Kaouther, I would have liked to ask the two of you how you experienced it, to sit there and have that exchange with the translators that translate into other languages. What was it like for you? Okay, I'll start. So for me, it was a great experience to work with the other translators. It was a very enriching experience. It made me broaden my perspective. It made me understand how the others work. It was very interesting to see what they understood, what they didn't understand, have an exchange about that. And yes, also to learn about the other languages, learn about the characteristics and the specificities of the other translations. And if you look at the examples of the poems that we started with, then I have to say I thought it was very productive. There were some parts, sometimes, parts of the poems where it was very difficult to work with that. But because we had the exchange, we managed to always find a solution. And I really enjoyed the experience. Compared to my usual work, when I work on my own on a translation, I think, yes, I enjoyed it. I think it's something that any translator would enjoy, really. And also, getting to know the other languages was something that I really enjoyed. What was it like for you, Mahmoud? Yes, it was similar. All four of us, Turkish, Kurmanji, Farsi, and Arab, all four languages come from the same region almost. And the feeling that I had was that all four of us know that we know a region that Droste didn't know herself. We know that she sat here and wrote about our region. And yes, that was a very abstract way of writing. And I think that's something that was interesting for all four of us. I saw that in the translations. We worked with Arabic and with Kurdish translators, and the terms, the words, the translations sometimes were similar. That was an experience that we all shared. So four from a region translate a poet that came from a different region, and I think that's something we had in common. Annie, would you like to add something to that? Sorry. I just wanted to say something quite very briefly. I learned that the word wa and the Arab wa also exists in Turkish. There were other terms as well in Persian that were very similar. There are many things that we have in common. Sorry. I'm done. Annie looked like she wanted to add something. No, not really. I was done, but I just thought it was extremely interesting. English, of course, is not that doesn't have anything in common with the other languages, but nonetheless we have those questions and we learn about things that we never even thought of because somebody all of a sudden says, okay, what was that in that stanza? And then you think, oh yeah, good point. Maybe I should think a little bit more about that. It's very helpful in that process. Okay, and a question for you, Annie. In the first part of the landscape lab, you mainly translated texts dealing with Westphalia into English. And the provocative question would now be translating Westphalia. Is that even possible? Do regional characteristics still make sense when they are translated into completely different languages or spaces? What would you say? That is a very good question, and I have to admit that I've never been to North Rhine-Westphalia. That is why maybe I can't even answer this question. I always had the impression that those poems, for me, are sort of transfer a British atmosphere. So those castles, those ruins, those empty landscapes, those voids, you know, they're not empty, but they seem like it, despite the fact that there's so much happening. That's something we know in Scotland, in northern England. So I thought, that's why I thought it was very fitting. In our group talks, I was always the one who said, no, let's stick to this image because it describes an atmosphere that I know from my own culture, the culture that I grew up in. But of course, there's this a poem called Der Heidemann. And it's a strange poem because on the one hand, it says it's not about ghosts, it's not about the fog, but apart from this footnote, there is no information on that ghost, this apparently known ghost. So really, I didn't know what solution we could find for that legend, for that story. But we talked a lot about that. And we really tried to understand how we could turn that into another sort of folk stories. There are so many different folk stories in Ireland, for example, about ghosts, for example, that come from the fog. And we really thought about maybe taking them or actually not taking them, because then it would have become something Irish. That was a bit of a tricky question. And so, yes, we said we call it the Heathman. It's a very direct translation that has nothing really to do with local folk tales. I think that was a good decision, but who knows? Sauerländer was another term that was difficult. She talked about the people from the Sauerland with a lot of humor, and that's very difficult to translate. I would have suggested we talk about the people from Yorkshire, but the others didn't agree on that. So, yeah, it's always a matter of, of discussion. But I think, yes, it is possible to translate it. You have to think a lot about it, but it does work. I remember that too. I remember that discussion. And now the opposite question to Mahmoud and Kaouther. In Sounds from the Orient, Annette von Droste-Hülshoff describes the Orient. So it's a very Eurocentric understanding of a place that doesn't even exist in that way, a sort of projection. As Edward Said says, that region doesn't actually exist. And how do you deal with that in translation? What strategies did you come up with to deal with this issue? What ideas? You talked about it a little bit at the beginning, Mahmoud. Maybe you would like to answer that question? If you come from a region, like the region where I come from, if you're from Iran, for example, and if you, like me, then study political sciences in Germany and then work in Iran, then you sort of have a pessimistic attitude towards what we call Orientalism. There's a saying in Persian saying, no cat catches a mouse in order to get God's approval. And I agree with that. I don't think Christopher Columbus went to wanted to go to India because he loves the Indians. No, there's so many people who tried well, who tried their best. The museums in the Western countries are now full of our artifacts, of our art pieces. I have so much respect towards all those grand masters. I don't want to show a lack of respect, but I'm not sure. Burgstall wanted to become a diplomat in Istanbul and then learned about the literature. Or Sakime Rückert, we heard the performance of Salem translated from 40 languages. Goethe did everything in his life, botanics, everything. And then he says, okay, now I'm going to try Hafiz, and I'll write that book. It's a wonderful book. And with Droste, I have the feeling, and we heard about that yesterday and the day before, that she had problems with herself, with her environment, with her father, and so on. And she wanted to liberate herself and thought about the Orient. And then she wrote that piece of art. And I have to admit, I didn't read much about Droste. I don't know whether she's that brutal in her other poems or whether she isn't. Whether this horror, whether she chose the Orient in order to write these brutal stories, and then for the German audience she wrote religious poems. I don't know. So whenever Orientalists come in, join the group, then I'm sort of skeptical. But I will be very neutral at translating Droste. I won't bring my fantasy or my mind play a big role here. But how to achieve that? Well, I said I try to keep my distance, and we met online at some point, and then I said, I think the poems that we worked with so far, that's more of a prose for me. And for me, as someone from Iran who lived with poetry for his whole life, then I would say, yes, there are some poetic moments in her poems. The Fall of the Barmakids, that's a prose, it's a tale for me. And that's easier for me. That's how I translate it. And something else that has to do with myself. Yesterday, the day before, I didn't hear much about it, and I didn't find anything about it online. So I tried to research online. The first translation of 1001 Nights took place in 1824, 1825. And Droste was 1835, I think, more or less. And I think she read 1001 Nights and not that much poetry. I'm sure Goethe wrote Iranian poetry and then wrote his divan. But I think Droste was influenced by 1001 Nights. It's a children's story. It's a story full of horror, full of cruelty when you read that book. And that's what Droste also does. And yesterday it was said that she wanted revenge, and that's why she wrote those brutal stories. But I think she was inspired by 1001 Nights. Does anybody know about that? Did she know the book?
I think we can't answer that with 100% certainty. We can't prove it. Right. But if you see the elements in the poems, in Iranian, Persian poetry, we don't have salespeople, we don't have gardeners, we don't have those figures. That is all included in 1001 Nights. Hassan, we don't have that name in our poetry. In 1001 Nights, it exists. So I suspect that she oriented herself towards 1001 Nights. And that is important to know for me, because I can translate her poems better if I know that 1001 Nights were a source of inspiration. Maybe we can come back to that thesis, but I would like to ask you, Kaouther, to tell us how you deal with that topic of the Orient and this issue. Well, in the beginning, I thought, now I'm going to translate a poet from the 19th century from Germany, a poet that wrote about the Orient. Let's see what she's going to write. I was very interested to see that. I think Edward Said's saying is very fitting for me as a German Orientalist. He says the stories, the connections between Orient and Occident are burdened with Orientalism because it's a false view of the Orient. If I turn inwards, however, if I look into myself, yes, that point about 1001 Nights, that's exactly what I thought as well. Droste pictured what she had seen. And for me, that Orient that Droste created, for me, such an Orient exists as well. I have an Orient like that in my head, in my fantasy, in my feeling. An Orient that doesn't really exist, only exists in me. And that was also created by 1001 Nights. So with these contexts in time and space, understanding the poet, a woman, back then, she was a poet, but she wasn't recognized. She had not the opportunity to actually fulfill her wants, and we can talk about whether everyone would have reacted in the same way as she did. Maybe there would have been opportunities to rebel against that stringent corset. So I don't really know. I'm a bit divided. The way she sees the Orient and the way she depicts it in her poems, that is also a part that I find that in myself as well, in my image of the Orient as well. Of course, that's not a depiction of the Orient that existed. The time is shortly after the fact that Napoleon embarked to Egypt. There were those archaeological digs in Egypt. The Arabic world was fashionable. It was the time of colonialism. It was the beginning of colonialism, really. And if I think about the poet, if I think about her, she, in her village, in her surrounding, I have to look at what did she read, what did she look at. So there was also a yearning for that faraway place in her. That's what I saw in her poetry. Yeah, I think that's very fitting. I would like to talk about another aspect, because the discussions that we are having here right now are supposed to be part of the project. And one opportunity to share that with others is the Droste Glossary, in which we have different entries that describe characteristics of Droste-Hülshoff's texts from the point of view of the translators. It is prepared for a broader audience. It's informative and entertaining. For example, you can read about strange word endings, punctuation in her poems. Annie, you brought us a couple of entries of that glossary. Maybe you could read them out to us. Yes. Do you want me to read them out, or do you want me to talk about the glossary first? Why don't you read the first entry, and then you can maybe talk about it a little bit. How did you come to write those glossary entries? Yeah. I'd love to. This is an entry that was written by Monika Rink, another translator, who's also a poet. It plays with language a little bit. It's not translatable. It's called Spook and Booze.
Mind, Soul. Sagen wir Mind oder sagen wir Soul? Meint ihr nicht Mind? Mind hätte sich nämlich sogar gereimt. Nein, es ist Soul. Wohl ist es Soul. Are you sure? Ja, ich bin sure. Dann müssen wir schauen, dass wir was finden, das im Rhythmus bleibt und doch auf Seele reimt. No, Gespenster are unlike good Geister. Jedes Mal, wenn ich Geist als Spirit übersetze, kommt Mind angerannt und bringt sich erneut ins Spiel. Spirit hätte doch etwas immer von Spuk und Schnaps, genau, besoffene Wiedergänger. Spiritistische Sitzungen, klappende Läden. Wie heißt es denn bei Hegel? Moment. The Phenomenology of Spirit or the Phenomenology of Mind, published in 1807. Dankeschön. Spirit oder Mind. Spirit ist gebräuchlicher. Sicher ist Spirit gebräuchlicher als Mind. Nicht wie du meinst. Spirit ist on my mind. Genau. Und also ich glaube wirklich, dass Monika
Yes, and I think Monika actually captured conversations that we had and transformed them into a little play, you could really say. In this entry, it was about how can we translate the German word Geist. It could be mind, it could be soul, it could be brain, it could also be a ghost, or it could be the spirit, such as the Holy Spirit, or soul. So there's multiple ways to translate it. And that really captures one of those moments where we were sitting there and we didn't know how to get out of that situation and what to do with it. So these problems where you get stuck, and these problems then find their way into the Droste glossary. There's one entry that is longer than the others, and it's called the Four Horsemen of Poetry translation. It only exists in English, actually. It has not been translated into German. Annie, could you explain to us what those four horsemen of poetry translation are? I can try. Shane wrote it. And it takes that idea from the last book. What's it called? The Revelation of Johannes. The last book in the Bible, the Revelations, of course. So and that is really what it's about. It's the end of the world. There's the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And that was Shane's idea. He took those horsemen, and those horsemen aren't about death, sickness, and war. It's about aspects in translation. And sometimes you have these ideas that come from pop culture. You have to make a decision, and you have the little demon on one shoulder, and you have the angel on the other shoulder, and they tell you their ideas. They tell you why you should be evil now, why you should be good right now. And I think that's what was in Shane's mind, that there's many different voices that try to tell you what you're supposed to do now when you translate. And I know that from myself. When I translate, I have that voice in my head that tells me, no, but you're straying too far from the source material here. And the other voice tells me, but it's not good English what you're producing here. So that's what that was about. But it was also about the fact that the four of us had very different perspectives. And Daniel, for example, always said, but semantically speaking, this is wrong. So Shane actually picked 4 aspects of translation, and that's the 4 superheroes. There's Semantics Man, someone who talks about semantics a lot, and there's Meta Med. They think about the meta level. Then there's Florist. They're about having a translation that is really nice and beautiful. And then there's the gambler, so someone who gambles, who runs risks. And that's the translator who says, hey, let's do away with the source material. Let's interpret this in a new way. And yeah, the idea is that you have to make ideas and then stick with them. That's the 4 aspects. And that reflected a bit the 4 people who were in the first lab. Yes, and I think it describes a problem that all translators know, I would say, that glossary. And that entry into the glossary and the entire glossary will be available on the Digital Castle. We are still constructing the website right now. Not everything is online yet, but it will be online very soon and open to the public. We heard that there's different perspectives on translating. There's different roles. So we could say, or we could ask, what role do you feel closest to? But I think that most translators can't even answer that question because they try to hear all the 4 voices and try to balance them out. In conclusion to our conversation, I would like to ask you the question, maybe let's get serious again. What would you say makes up the writing of Droste? What was the most difficult to translate into your language? Mahmoud, maybe you would like to start. Now, there's always problems. Not only when translating Annette von Droste-Hülshoff, but translating in general. If I would start translating the Süddeutsche Zeitung, a big German newspaper, if I translate that into Persian or Farsi, that would be an issue because German, Farsi and Persian have zero overlap. They have nothing in common. They share nothing. For example, in our language, we don't have genders. We don't know masculine, feminine, neutrum. So an Iranian can live for 100 years. They will never be able to construct a German passive sentence. They will never be able to formulate a German conjunctive. The grammar is completely different. Vocabulary is also very different. If you live in the north of Tehran, you speak a different Persian than if you live in the south of Tehran. If you are a taxi driver in Tehran, you have a different language than a salesperson. So we always face these problems. The way we write is something we never speak. So there's a theater German, of course, but no one speaks as they write. That's always the case, whether it's the president or anyone else. If we look at Droste's work, a classic, a very local classic, there are problems. And you helped us a lot with many terms that we didn't know at all, like the dry mouths. That was an allusion to Maultier. And yeah, I thought it was about dry mouths, right? But no, it was about camels. That was a wordplay on the German word for camel. So there are these images that exist there. And yeah, and then on the grammatical level, there's also a problem. There's also problems. But speaking about the 4 horsemen, I think we need a fifth one. That's the horseman that translates correctly. Because I would say, so the florist, that is a bit pejorative, the way we use it, but maybe that's the right thing. I always referenced Schleiermacher when I was young. Schleiermacher says the reader must become the author and the author must become the reader. reader. And I always tried to move author and reader and make it possible that they meet in the middle somewhere.
Oh, very interesting to hear that. Thank you for that background information. Kaouther, what would you say? What was the specific problem when it comes to translating those texts? Like I said, the beginning was pretty easy. I've been living in Germany for quite a while, but of course the German language has really changed. So for me, okay, I had to understand what was meant at the beginning, and like Mahmoud said, the mouths that were just mentioned, that was very strange for me to hear. I thought of, yes, a dry mouth. Anyone could have a dry mouth. But yes, those 4 horsemen, I gotta say, I only understood that today, what was behind all that. I think any translator knows the conflict between the 4 aspects. It's not something that you're aware of, but of course you want to harmonize everything. You want to make sure that each one of them feels represented. And the translator is always a traitor, no matter what he or she does. We can try our best, and it pays off, even if we are traitors. So I would say the metrum, well, no, forget about that. I don't care about that. If I would try to keep the metrum, then my fantasy would get lost, the meter. Semantics, for me, is more important. I focus on that. And the rest, that's kind of a game. And the florist is very important, of course. The translation in the target language has to sound as natural, as fluent as possible. So I don't want it to be rigid. Yes, it's translated, but I want it to be fluid and natural. I think Droste's work, for me so far, there weren't that many conflicts for me, but I can imagine that the other poems, like the short poems with a lot of adjectives, this is going to be tricky for me to translate that into Arab. The adjectives, they sort of have a different weight. And yeah, to find a balance there, that will be tricky, will be challenging. That was my statement. Annie, what about you? I just really had to laugh because I really like the meters, and I know that Shane thought about me when he wrote the meter maid. That's me. So the difficulties I encountered were mainly in the first texts, the landscape group, where Droste really worked a lot with the meter and with rhymes. And the meter, for me, is the engine of the poem. So I thought it was very interesting to try to keep that alive. But it is interesting because in English, for example, certain meters work really well, and others do not work at all. And then the question is, of course, whether you can change the rhythm in order to make sure that it stays fluid, or if you want to stick to it, if you want to stick to what Droste used. So I really enjoy the meters. Rhymes are very difficult for me. And Droste was very rigid and partly, yeah, in part she was very strict when it came to the rhymes. And I think that really brings us to the question about how to translate texts into the 21st century. There, for me, it was really important to make sure that the idea, the feeling of those poems stays alive. They are rhymed poems, so that's important, but you don't want to write a poem that today sort of sounds like a parody of a 19th century poem. So I think today we don't work as much with rhymes, so that is sort of a risk to stick to the rhymes. I tried to work with semi-rhymes. That was sort of my private solution. But yeah, it was challenging. It was a bit of a struggle. And you also said that it's not that easy to transfer trochees into English. Exactly. In German, a trochee is a verse where you have a strong syllable and then a weak syllable. And in German, that works really well because we have all those words, deine, meine, ihre. You can start a verse or a stanza with that, and then the endings of the words, like any adjective usually ends with a weak syllable, oder, or meiner, alter. All those are examples in German for trochees. All of them are trochees. It's very natural in German. But in English, in English, iams are very natural for us. I can talk in iams without thinking about it, but if I want to use trochees, then I have to work hard, and it always sounds sort of stiff. So I try to translate the trochees into iams because it just makes more sense. It sounds better, I would say. Thank you very much for those impressions. And thank you for letting us take a glance sort of behind the stage and finding out about what happens when texts are translated. You now have the opportunity to ask our translators anything also via the chat. That's why, I'd say let's have a look at the questions. Okay, no questions? Oh yeah, there's one question. Very good. Hi, I do have a question to the Farsi translator and the Arabic translator. In the texts, there are words like muezzin, Allah, mosque, jinn, and that sort of leads to the German reader feeling feeling like he reads about something from far away, foreign, but that doesn't apply to the Arab reader. So how can that feeling be transported, that feeling that a German reader has when he or she reads those poems? How can we transfer that so that Arab readers can also enjoy that? That's a very good question. So far, we haven't had that problem with the muezzin. And yes, of course, it does have a different sound in German than it does in Arabic. So I don't know what solution we'd have to find for that. Yes, the problem exists. With those poems, there's nothing you can do. Also, because of jinn, I said, I'm sure that Droste was inspired by 1001 Nights. Yesterday, we talked to our friends here, and I'm not naming anyone right now, but a very good friend of mine wanted me to translate her novel into Persian, and I said, that's not possible. Your novel is interesting for the German audience, but everything you describe in your novel is our daily life in Iran, so it's simply not interesting for us. Larger project, there it's easy because you can simply say, no, we're not doing that. But here it's difficult. So maybe you can create an atmosphere with words so that the mosque or the jinn, that's there. I know that the men in those poems, they're all called Hassan. Our president is called Hassan. many people, many men, old men are called Hassan, but not young people. So that's why I think you have to create a poetic atmosphere, an atmosphere of words to make sure that it makes sense. Otherwise, there's nothing you can do. Yes, we also had this problem with the names. The name example, the Malmuna, Zila, those names that she chose. How to translate that into Arabic, that's a conflict, because you can't project it 100% the way that she intended it in her time. Yes, the lover of Barmeke is Abbasi. And for some reason, Droste chose Meyune, and I would simply leave that out. That might help a little bit, so that the Iranian reader understands that she wants to describe something foreign. We do have another question. Yes, first of all, thank you very much. I really enjoyed listening to you talk about what you dealt with in that lab. And I thought it was very interesting to hear about 1001 Nights and how that could have been an inspiration. Ottmar Ette talked about that yesterday. He said that it's a collection that was probably written and created in India. So it's already a projection into a different space, that Orient that was created there, that was invented there, is a fairy tale. It is a projection. Droste, you can see that there are those multiple distances. In her text, Die Judenbuche, she talks about a place that she knows geographically, Eastern Westphalia, not Münsterland, where we are right now, but nonetheless Westphalia. But she describes it in a different time. So she introduces a certain distance, and then she tries to tell a story that she knows from what her uncle had told her about, and she also uses her fantasy. And I think what it's really about is that a criminal case simply can't be solved, but that people sort of project everything. And I would say that, yes, it's about intertextuality, so relating, connecting texts to other texts. We learn writing by reading, and it's not a game. Nonetheless, we're still responsible when we translate. We have to look at the context, but nonetheless, it's also, we're allowed to play with projections. Is that something that you could say, that you would say is acceptable, or do you disagree? Maybe the question is too suggestive, but the matter of phantasmas, projections that can be found there, isn't that always the case? And how open are we when it comes to dealing with that? Yes, I think what's written there is enough. 1001 Nights, I would say. Yes. I think 2 days ago we talked about that. It's called 1001 Nights. Apparently, it was written in Iran. There's a classic called 1000 Fairy Tales. And 1000 Fairy Tales, that apparently was transported to India, and then it arrived back in Iran. But no matter whether it was Indian or Persian, I think, I enjoy translating Droste. So far, we always only saw that love for the Orient at Goethe. So 4 or 5 translations of Goethe can be found in Iran. Of course, not everybody in Iran reads Goethe, but nonetheless, I think it is nice. And now it's nice to also have an alternative. And I would say that right now, I can say, if the Iranians, if people in Iran read those poems, Droste's poems, they all think about 1001 Nights, because all the elements can be found in there, like the vultures, for example. All this exists in 1001 Nights, and I think the Iranian readers will associate it. They will make that connection, and therefore this atmosphere will be created.
Annie, you would like to add something? Yes. And of course, it's a completely different dynamic if you translate the sounds from the Orient into English. And Jörg, maybe I misunderstood your question, but I think about it a lot. What does it mean to translate ethically? I think translating translators have a responsibility about what they translate, who they translate. Translating is always political. There's 2 or 3 poems that I translated of contemporary artists, and I talked to them and I approached them and said, hey, there's a huge stereotype in your poem here, and that's not always well received. And then we often reworked the English version. And in the English version, for example, we did away with that stereotype or that cliche. So in the end, you always have to think about the ethics in translating. And that's more difficult if you can't engage in a direct conversation with the author. I have no answer how to deal with this issue, but I think it's something that we need to reflect on while translating. That's the very least that Droste did project when she wrote these poems, and that we carry that along when we work on the poems. That's a lovely conclusion, I would say, for our conversation, and it's also a perfect bridge to our next point of the agenda, our last panel, and that is called Political Dimensions of Translation. We're going to have that panel at 5:30 today. Thank you, Kaouther Tabai, Mahmoud, Hosseini, Annie Rutherford. Thank you for being here. Thank you for giving us that impression of your work, giving us that insight. Thank you for the audience. Thank you to the team as well. And we'll see you again at 5:30 for the last panel.